The state of mind of a prisoner is an interesting thing because while there are a few generalizations, for the most part it's a very individual reaction. If you were in the American infantry, you didn't have to be there long before you realized that after 90 days in a frontline company, you were either dead or wounded or became a prisoner. Becoming a prisoner might actually be a relief momentarily. On the other hand, for everybody, the fact you had no control over your life whatsoever anymore was a major psychological blow. And even more so for people that had a lot of control before they were prisoners, such as officers, and especially flying officers who are virtually autonomous in their little aircraft. They could go through a major depressive episode after they were captured.
It was kind of a shock, and in fact the pictures there, my ID card, I looked kind of wild anyway, and I was only 24 years old. And but in the camp they put me in with some British officers, because there were only about 6 Americans in that particular compound. I think there were about 500 officers in that compound. Most of them were British, and about 5 or 6 Americans. So I lived with these British officers for about 5 or 6 months. And just real nice people there. I formed a real admiration for the British. You know, they're not big people. They need a lot of dental work, but they got a lot of guts. They'd stand up to those Germans that it was interesting. Some Germans start giving them a bad time. They start shouting at them. They make them back down. So I lived with these Britishmen for about 5 or 6 months. Then it got to be so many Americans coming in the camp, the Germans decided to put us in a separate barracks.
The German POW system grew as the war progressed. They took a lot of prisoners in 39 and 40, but they didn't intend to keep them for very long. And as it happened, many of them went through the POW system and became laborers, an entirely separate group, very quickly. Once they started to capture increasing numbers of Americans and British, they couldn't legally put out on the farms to work, not to mention the fact that it was a good way to lose them. They needed a bigger POW system. And there was a huge spate of camp building in 42 and 43.
The Americans are really getting shot down. They used to call, when they bring in a bunch of Americans, they call it a purge. They bring in 25 or 30 American officers about every 10 days or 2 weeks. So it wasn't too long before I think the Americans outnumbered the British about 3 to 1 in these camps, because they were shooting down B-17s and B-24s over Europe. So they're really slaughtered is what it was.
The Americans, all airmen, all air officers on one side of the camp and all British on the other. And the only communication we had was a semaphore and sign language, that sort of thing. We got all our news from the British. They had radios, probably from bribing guards, you know. But that's where we ended up, and that's where I spent most of my time, was in Saigon.
Got to the camp on June 6th and was processed, and while we were in there, the Germans had a loudspeaker system. And in German, I heard the words, "Heute der große Kampf in den Westen hat begonnen." And there was a guy next to me. I said, "What the hell are they talking about?" He said, "The second front has started." He said, "We've invaded." It was the Heute, today the great battle in the West has begun. Well, that was the invasion day. So they told us, you know, with their loudspeaker system in German. And I kind of said, "Oh, hell, we'll be out of here in 6 weeks." And then nearly a year later, I'm still there, you know.
About 14 barracks, and each barracks had about 8 rooms. Each room held about 8 men, and then on either end there were 2 rooms that could hold 2 people, and generally that was kept for the guy in charge of the barracks. They call it barracks commander. I was barracks commander, so you're kind of liaison between the senior American officer and his staff, and your people in your barracks. So if you had to pass anything on, they'd pass it on to us, and we pass it on to the men in the barracks. And then the other room was a nighttime privy.
Each room had a little stove where they gave us, I don't know, just a few lumps of coal, 5 or 6 lumps of coal that we could burn every day. And it was really bitter cold in the wintertime. And then each barracks had a kitchen, you might say, with a coal stove. And we all the rooms took turns cooking whatever we could find to cook.
Well, it was a reasonably well-built camp, of course, surrounded by 2 rows of barbed wire, and there were 4 compounds separated. And I have no idea how many guys were in the compound, but we had reasonably good barracks. Had a nice mattress, which was a big burlap sack the size of a single bunk, and you stuffed that full of Excelsior wood shavings, stringy stuff, and you stuffed that burlap bag as full as you could of that Excelsior, and after you slept on it about a week, it was down to maybe an inch thick, so you were just sleeping on boards. Had 6 boards in your bunk, and you better have them there all the time, because they were afraid you'd use them to shore up a tunnel.
We slept on boards, you know. They had a little platform, and then above that platform, I'd say maybe 4 foot high was another platform. And you had one German Army blanket. And of course, we'd double up and help some, but you were sleeping on board, so you know it wasn't comfortable and it wasn't conducive to good sleep.
The first thing you ran into if you went toward the fence was just a single wire on stakes. They called it a warning wire. And the signs that they had posted said anyone who crossed this wire would be fired upon immediately. The Americans, of course, didn't do much of that. Then there was 2 fences that were like 9 or 10 feet tall. They looked like woven wire, but they were woven out of barbed wire. And there were 2 of them, and they were like 12 feet apart. So if you got over one, you still had to go over another one.
Yeah, there was about a 30-foot strip, they call it. I don't know what they call it, but it was between the main fence, and then there was a little fence about that high. It was about right along, there was a path that went around the whole perimeter of the camp, and the little fence about those high. You weren't supposed to go into that area because it was all they put sand, white sand there, so you'd be very visible. And you just didn't go in that area because if a German saw you in there, they could shoot you. And they generally did.
And they had places where we could walk outside, and they had a wire about foot high, I guess, on pegs all the way around the compound. And if we set our foot on that, they would shoot us. And of course we knew that, so we didn't do it. And as long as you did what you were told, I can't say that the treatment was bad.
And we had some incidences. I mean, one day, a good way to commit suicide, I guess. This one prisoner, he knew that if he jumped over there and started running up and crawl the fence, that the guard right there would shoot him. He was just committing suicide.
You know, you're supposed to give your name, rank, and serial number, but they reasoned, if that's all you give, how are we going to get you mail to your loved ones at home? So you end up giving them almost everything they want.
One of the great psychological problems of being a POW is the sense of isolation, in that you are cut off from home, from country, from the military establishment you were in. Any mail from home, even as simple as a postcard, is a tremendous psychological boost. It is a reconnection with even the most impersonal aspects of home life. even if it was impersonal mail, like a newspaper from home, or news from the front or from outside the very controlled POW environment, was a tremendous boost to morale. And the rumor mill in the camps was probably as active as any, and goodness knows it's active enough in the military as it is. But among POWs, information was freedom, and mail from home was a sign of freedom.
Sometimes we wouldn't get any mail for 2 or 3 weeks, and all of a sudden they'd bring in mail and you'd get half a dozen letter a done. We had a good friend of mine used to get, his wife used to write him once or twice a day sometimes, and when he got a big batch, he'd get about 30 or 40 letters. He'd arrange them according to postmark and then start reading them. So we got mail fairly good. We realized it was contingent on transportation, by the German transportation.
I was only there less than 6 months. Nobody got any word from home in the length of time I was a prisoner. I think you had to be a prisoner a year or two before you get any mail back from home. Maybe earlier in the war they did, but
We were allowed personal parcels, and it could contain clothing. It had to be military, and it could contain, like my wife used to send vitamins and like razor blades and things like that.
It wasn't always easy to get the mail, even though it's supposedly guaranteed by international agreements. There are physical problems with getting the mail to the POWs, especially late in the war when all the systems in Germany are breaking down and transportation of anything becomes problematic. There was at least one instance in which a train carrying some POWs in the back and a bunch of mail in the front was bombed by the Americans, and the POWs were almost as upset about the fact that the mail cars that probably had some POW mail in it were burned to a crisp as it was that they were standing in the woods watching their transportation go up.
and that bothers me to this day as much as anything. That was hard, very hard. But I went overseas September, I was captured November, and I never got no more mail until I was home. I remember seeing 36 abreast and just so many. They were up there so high, they were just tiny dots in the sky. So we kind of smiled, you know, and stood there a moment, and then the guards would holler at us, tell us to go back to work. They, of course, they hated them, Fliegers, they called them. But I didn't see flyers go over very often, though. That's why when we did, we were pretty excited about it.
From a POW standpoint, any contact with your own side is to be cherished. And even an indirect contact, like watching friendly aircraft fly overhead, is a contact with home. And it can be a particular morale booster when, in late 44, the only aircraft flying overhead are American or British because there's no Luftwaffe left. This is the kind of information the camp can't suppress, and you can pretty much infer the war's going our way. No matter what they tell us about great German victories, the fact remains all the planes overhead have stars or circles on them instead of crosses.
They would keep telling us how the Germans were winning the war, how they were pushing the Americans, and they were almost pushed them back into the sea, and they would, you know, all of this kind of propaganda. For what reason, I don't know, unless it was just to demoralize us. But then when we'd see these wave after wave of bombers going over, that was an encouraging thing because we knew we still had a lot of firepower.
We saw P-38s and P-51s. While in camp, some of the guys were thinking ahead, I think, and they had constructed an American flag that's probably 8 feet long, and whenever there were planes in the vicinity, they would grab this flag and stretch it out so it could be seen, you know. And our own planes would come over and waggle their wings, so then we knew they'd recognize us. And the camp I was in, of course, that portion that I was in was strictly Air Force personnel. And of course, the Germans knew that, and every once in a while, a German pilot would buzz us at very low altitude, you know, it's barely over the camp, and the guys would throw rocks at him, but by the time they got their rock up there, the plane was long gone. So I started to tell them that you've got to throw your rock way ahead of time so he'll fly into it, and so they started doing that, and lo and behold, they did get a rock up in the right place, and he picked it up in his oil cooler, and he crash landed in the field not far away.
several times while we were out lined up, 3 ME-109s had come flying over. I don't know if they were training or coming back from a mission or what. I suspicion training. And they knew we were all flyers. So they'd buzz the field and peel off in wingovers, you know, showing off a little. Well, one day one of them peeled off and flew the thing right into the ground and blew up. And we all said, well, there's no way that guy could survive with 5,000 of us down there saying, blow up, you son of a bitch. We started cheering and doing stupid things, so they cut loose with machine guns over our head to calm us down, which did real quick. Every day, at least twice a day, we all had to line up out in front of our barracks, and the Germans would count us. We lined up in fives, because that's the only way they knew how to count, I guess. And if you've ever heard them count in German, you know it's quite slow. It wasn't so bad if it was good weather, but in bad weather, it wasn't much fun standing out there while they tried to make their count come out even, because somebody usually be sound asleep, wasn't out there.
Well, they would make us fall out for, they called it inspection. They would count. They sometimes they'd count us 3 or 4 or 5 times a day, you know, but depending on how angry they were, I suppose. But sometimes a little man would stand on a big man's feet because we had these long GI overcoats and he would be hidden. But we'd hide, the guy would hide, and then they would count. They'd be short one, so then right away they'd have to do a recount. So then by that time he'd very carefully get down there and he'd be counted, you know. And then quite often they'd count him again just to be sure, and then he'd be back in his overcoat again. It happened quite a bit.
There were 2 guys. One guy had his left leg off. The other guy had his right leg off in various places. And one guy had his hand off right at his wrist. And they were in our barracks. And when they'd line up to be counted, 5 deep, one guy'd stand behind the other one. So there's 2 feet showing, but there's 2 guys there. So the count's completely off. The other guy with the wrist severed, I hope this is okay to say, he had this big old stump, you know, of a wrist with no hand. He'd stick his arm down through the placket of his pants, so his arm was sticking out through his pants. The guard would come along looking down, counting, and that'd throw him completely off. He'd lose his count.
Every morning they'd line us up out front, 4 abreast. And the commandant, he'd stand there, and then he'd send one of his guards down counting. And these guys, somebody always clowning up, "Ein, zwei, drei, vier." And then the guys were shifting on him, and this one day this guard was coming by counting, and this one of the guys in the second line, he reached down and goosed this guy that was goosey, and this guy just jumped right out there. And of course, everybody got a laugh, even the commandant, you know. There was some funny things, and, you know, here you got a bunch of guys, they're young. We still have that ego, you know, and what have you, and it's hard to explain.
The greatest killer in war, after actual weapons, is psychological stress. And second only to the frontline infantry, the stress on the battlefield is the stress of a prisoner who, as I mentioned, has no control over his environment, no control over his fate, and is in the hands of his enemies. And even disregarding problems with food and medical care and living conditions, which especially in winter in the camps could be pretty primitive, the psychological stress could wear men down. And there were men who quite literally committed suicide in the camps by throwing themselves in front of the guards' weapons. Nobody is immune to it. The toughest fellow can be broken sooner or later. It's just a question of whether that happens before he's killed by something else. In the camps, there was a huge chance that depression and psychological stress was going to get to you the longer you were there. The way you combat stress in a POW camp is the same way you combat it anywhere else. You take your mind off it by being active in other things.
Got monotonous to the point that at one time I could tell you how many barbs there was between this part of the fence and that part of the fence out there. And one thing that I did do, I kept busy all the time. We had a few that kind of went off their rocker as a result of just boredom. And even though I wasn't in good physical condition, I was probably in better than most of them that was there because of the kind of training we had. But at the same time, I exercised on a regular basis while I was there. Even in the snow, I'd walk in the snow.
Reading was a real pastime for most of the people. I know it certainly was for me, because all you did is read, and I learned to play bridge there, and so I used to play bridge in the winter or evenings, or read. Really, we're able to keep ourselves busy. Some guys weren't able to occupy themselves, and they went what we went around the bend. They just went nuts.
At one point, they tried to have boxing matches, and some of us would pick our favorite, and we'd donate a cube or two of sugar to give them more strength. And there were one-round boxing matches. It was about the end of that. That didn't work very good.
There was some recreation. We had a fire pool there for fire protection. And when it froze in the wintertime, the Red Cross or the Swedish protecting power, somebody gave us some clamp-on ice skates, and we had some hockey sticks, so we played hockey. And, of course, we had football or two and some baseball stuff. The British had their soccer stuff. And the only thing we had to do as officers is just amuse ourselves. We had a library. They did some theater work.
We had a big theater building, and it came in handy. We used it for a lot of things. We had road shows. We had church services, of course. We had a lot of guys in camp were musicians, so we got in. They got musical instruments from the Red Cross.
They put on plays, and some would dress as women, and it would put on a pretty good show. We call it the cardboard theater because they used lots of cardboard for props.
The people in the theater did a wonderful job to keep the POWs sane. And we had a play going maybe 3-4 nights. I don't know. I don't remember now how long. But even the Germans would come and they'd sit in the front of the theater.
Theatrical productions, because they require virtually no outside help and just somebody who can remember some lines or can write something, were a big source of activity. And they range from musical productions to simple skits to satires, and those were always popular, especially if you could work in anti-German, anti-Nazi satire and get away with it. The British, if anything, had an advantage because a lot of their officers' education involved memorizing large amounts of Shakespeare and other plays, which they could introduce into the camps. Americans tended to be a little more inventive, and they went for everything from musical comedy to vaudeville, to just outright made up as you went along. But this had the advantage of both entertaining you, of taking your mind off the stress, and possibly acting as a bit of opposition when you could work in some digs on the guards and the commandant system.
Your air crew were in Luftwaffe prison camps, and as I say, they divided them up. They had that, then they had the officers' camps, and they had the non-commissioned officers' camp, and then they had the enlisted men's camps, and those they forced to work.
I never will forget going in there because there was a big sign in front of the main gate that said, "Work makes you free." That was the big thing that was on all the stalags.
Enlisted prisoners can be put to work. That's the international law. And the Germans made a great use of the POW workforce simply because Germany was labor short throughout the war. There was a great difference in how they used prisoners from the Eastern Front versus the Western Front. For the most part, they stayed within the letter of the law with American or British or Canadian prisoners. And at the work details were enlisted men with their own NCOs in charge, and they were not directly and immediately related to war work. Now, that wasn't 100%. But for the most part, if they're working in a factory, it wasn't a factory making tanks, it was a factory refurbishing uniforms. Not quite within the law, but not quite outside of it either. Or they were cutting wood, they were cutting peat, they were doing cleanup work along the road, something that you couldn't say they were directly aiding the war effort, although of course they were, because everything during the war was. The conditions on the work details could vary dramatically, especially as the Germans started running out of resources. Work details could find themselves in extreme danger.
We could have worked in the beet factory, sugar factory, or in some of the other places they had there, and we would have gotten better quarters and better food, but there wasn't very many of us volunteered to do that. Most of us toughed it out.
We were there for, I guess, about a month, and I kept thinking, how are we going to get out of this? What can we do? And they used to come through and ask for volunteers for what they called their Arbeitskommando, or work detail. And I kept wondering if they fed any better on an Arbeitskommando and what kind of work it was.
We got no breakfast, we got a dipper of tea at noon, and we got 2 little new potatoes about the size of small eggs for dinner. Well, I soon found there was a method to that. After feeding us that type of fare for about a week, they came in and said, now, if you will volunteer to go out and work, you'll get better food. Well, I was a non-com, so I didn't have to volunteer. But I figured it couldn't be any worse than this, so I did volunteer. I had been holding church services in the Stalag there. They let me do that, and I kind of hated to give that up, but seemed like it was going to be a matter of survival.
The main camps were just absolutely hideous, terrible. So I do feel very lucky. I was on a work party from the 8th of February until the 30th of April. They sent us out in the country about 40 miles, and that's where I cut wood with hand tools. And it was hard work, and it's tough to work when you're hungry, but it is so much better. I was very fortunate to be in this work camp cutting wood. We weren't near any bombings. And like I say, we worked every day except Sunday, about a 10-hour day. We'd walk to work 2.5 miles and start to work at 8, and then we'd cut wood till noon, and at noon we'd get a quart of boiled rutabagas. They had a Polish prisoner that he wasn't a war prisoner. He'd bring out this soup, a 10-gallon milk can full of boiled rutabagas for 44 of us, so we had almost a quart. And so after you got done eating that, you're hungrier than ever because you went out there in the morning without anything to eat. And so you kind of get numb. Your hunger kind of gets numb.
We were sent to a little village called Hoffenlohr. And we were told we were going to work in a factory. Well, it was some factory. We were put into some barracks about a quarter mile from the factory out of this little village. All 53 of us, this barracks. But this factory that they put us in was a baby crib factory. And we manufactured baby cribs in there. However, there was something strange about that factory. It had a great many antennas on the roof. And also, when we were moving about in different parts of that factory, we would run across large crates which were addressed to propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. And we knew there was something beyond baby cribs going on in that factory.
They came through about the third time I noticed it, looking for Arbeitskommando volunteers, and I didn't back up quite fast enough. I decided, well, I better not go yet. I better find out more what it is. But they grabbed me and put me on a train with another couple of guys. And we didn't know where we were going. They had one guard and three of us. And we started working on the railroad. Every morning they woke us at dawn and took us out to some part of the railroad that needed repairs. Sometimes it was right in Leipzig, like we worked lots of days right outside that Bahnhof, that big Leipzig station. Other times they took us out to little neighborhood areas that had been bombed.
Low-ranking prisoners like myself, we were worked alongside of Dachau inmates. In our case, we worked in the Munich rail yards, which was a primary target for the American and British Air Forces. So it continued to fill up the holes to make the trains run. So we'd get in there at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, freezing cold, snowing. It was the coldest winter in Europe in the 20th century up to that point. But the Dachau people, I worked alongside of them in Munich rail yards, and they were in terrible shape. We were not in great shape. They were doing heavy work too. They had them moving rails, steel rails, and putting them in place. And they would hammer them down after heavy raids as all stuff was blown up. And you know how heavy those damn things are? I mean, of course, there was a lot of them with like ice picks, and they could only carry them so far they have to drop them. So they had a regular chant that they used. That's when I first noticed them. Yeah. If you ever doubted there was the Holocaust, all you had to do was work a few days alongside of them. Dressed just as you see them in the pictures, you know. And I was staying in a group of Dachau inmates mixed with Allied POWs, and the Krauts were trying to round us up and separate us, and they were yelling and pushing, but they hadn't got to where we were. We were standing still waiting for them. And I was talking to a man who spoke English. He said he'd been a pianist in Warsaw, and he held up his hands, and all the knuckles had been broken and so forth. And he said, it won't be long, my friend, and we'll drink the bastard's blood. The next day, we came back in there to work again, and these people, and I'm sure he was one of them, they were digging a big trench, and somebody yelled to us, we're digging our own grave. And the grave was filled when we passed later that day. That was a common practice at the end, they just machine gun them, you know.
You know how a bunch of soldiers are. They talk about booze and women. Not in prison camp. Not after the first few days, anyhow. You talk about food. You can make up menus, dream up menus, go to sleep at night, and you dream about food. You'd even dream about sea rations if you can.
Conditions weren't bad. It was cold and wet, and there was no food. Red Cross parcels. But the Germans had no food, you know, so they weren't going to give it to us. So when I came out of there, I weighed 115 pounds.
The German food was not very, there was not too much of it. It limited mainly to potatoes and black bread and ersatz margarine. And once in a while we get some a cabbage or a kohlrabi. I don't know if you've ever seen a kohlrabi. It's a root, comes like this and got things sticking out of it, and we used to get those once in a while, but we used to think that they were tough, and we used to say, well, we had a recipe for them, and we'd trim them good and put them in a pot of boiling water with a rock, and you'd boil it, and when the rock was soft, then the kohlrabi was ready to eat. That's how tough they were.
The worst thing about that whole experience was lack of food, and the Germans themselves didn't have much. I've never felt bitter towards the Germans except for what they did, you know. I mean, the people in control. We got from them kohlrabi, which is a vegetable that they fed their hogs, and that's about all we got from the Germans. We got a meal, barley, I believe it was, but they would just heat that in water and give it to us, and we either ate it or left it, and of course, we ate anything we could get.
We would get a canteen cup full of soup once a day and a small chunk of that black German sour bread. And that was our daily meal. And it would vary. And on Wednesday, and I can't to this day stand even the smell of sauerkraut, on Wednesday each week we had watered down sauerkraut soup. And it would cramp you to where you couldn't, but you would eat anything. And when I hear these people say, oh, I wouldn't eat that, and you know, it would be, they've never been hungry, or they wouldn't say that kind of thing. You would eat anything that you could get that was food.
Morning, you got ersatz coffee, which was just dark-colored water, hot water, and had very little taste, but it was something. Some guys used it to shave with because there was no hot water.
They gave you ersatz stuff, you know. The bread was black bread, and I didn't. First time I got it when in the farmhouse, I didn't like it, but then it tasted like cake after a few months.
Sometime during the day, usually midday or somewhere in mid-morning, you get a bread ration, which was probably two normal slices of bread, dark German bread, which was very heavy, and once you learned to digest it, it was okay because it stuck to your stomach.
But I can remember they'd bring the bread in, and it was one loaf to 6 men. And we'd have it there, and then everybody would sit there to see the shape of the loaf, you know, it was contoured, so we decided where it should be cut. And then we'd draw straws, and the first guy got his first pick of the bread.
And then usually in the evening we'd get a few potatoes in the old bucket, and they were the culls that they normally fed to the hogs, little ones, size of a cherry tomato. Some of them rotten, but when we first got there, you were so damn hungry, having been used to eating, and all of a sudden, bang, you're not eating. You're so hungry, you ate those dang potatoes. Rotten or good, it didn't make any difference.
And all we got was a little weak soup, if we were lucky, and bread, dark bread, sawdusty bread. And we were all losing weight. Not that we were starving, really, but we were darn hungry. It was a hellish experience. I lost 45 pounds, and I weighed about 85 or 90 when I was captured, because I haven't always been good sized. But some of the little guys, they really wasted their weight in nothing.
Sometimes Americans, planes would come over somewhere in the area, not right there, it could be 30 miles away, and they would strafe, and they'd kill horses and livestock in the process. Some of their artillery was pulled by horses. So when that happened, then we'd get a little horse meat to eat. And one day they would skin a head and boil the whole head, you know, in a great big kettle. And I got a big old eyeball in a bit of soup one day. We didn't get much meat. If there was a rat or cat or anything that came through camp, chances are he didn't make it through. Somebody would try to catch him.
You couldn't, you know, you wouldn't do it today, but you certainly did it there. Caught a cat once, killed it, ate it.
On Tuesday, we had barley soup, and that was probably the best meal of the week. And when you first was in the prison camp, you'd take the weevils that would float to the top and scrape them off. But after a while, that was food, and you ate everything, and it was probably the healthiest part of the soup, really, because I understand that weevils have a great deal of protein.
Another time we thought we had black-eyed peas, and then somebody discovered that there was some small half-grown flies floating around on top of their bowl, and after looking, why, everybody had a few. So everybody's scooping them off and eating them anyway. Then somebody discovered that the half-grown flies were the black eyes in the peas, so some ate and some couldn't. And, for every guy that couldn't eat his, somebody else ate it for him, you know.
They were great on turnip soup, and turnip soup always had worms in it. And when I first got there, I got pretty hungry, and before I could eat that, you know. And there was always some older timers around there ready to take your portion. But I got so I could scoop the worms out and put them aside and go ahead. We always had black bread when we had bread, and it was like 25% ground wood. It was, you know, real finely ground wood like flour. The Germans, I guess, did not have much food, and even when the Red Cross did ship some parcels, all too often they disappeared before they got to us.
And then, of course, our diet was supplemented with the Red Cross parcels, which were, whether we got them or not, was contingent on transportation. They came out of Geneva, and then, of course, they were transported into our camp by German rail, and they didn't have the high priority. So sometimes we didn't get any parcels for quite a while.
I did get Red Cross food, and about half, I think, of what a person would have got if you'd have got the full allotment. But sometimes you'd share a box with 4 guys, sometimes 2, and sometimes you didn't get nothing. I kind of kept track. I figure I got about half of a Red Cross allocation, which was a very blessing, a very helpful, because it was just the things we didn't have. We had all this bulky stuff that didn't have any food value in it, and so we got some concentrated food.
It's not a question just of having enough calories. You can have enough calories if you eat turnips, but you'll die of malnutrition very quickly. The Red Cross parcels tended to have a lot of concentrated, high carbohydrate, high fat, chocolates, concentrated foods, meat, high protein, which was simply not available in Germany. Remember, in Germany, they were using coffee substitute from 1940 because it was simply unavailable. Sugar was almost unavailable unless it was processed from sugar beets. So the high-value foods were already in short supply before American POWs even showed up in quantity, and were virtually unobtainable within the last year of the war.
We had a value system. We had chocolate, what were referred to as D-bars, which were the most expensive, and cigarettes were expensive. You could barter with other people for stuff. The Red Cross would send cigarettes, although I always considered that they should have sent food instead of cigarettes. But the man that didn't smoke got just as many cigarettes as the man that did, which gave him an advantage because he could trade them all off for food.
I started to smoke in a prison camp. I never smoked in my life, but we'd light a cigarette, a Red Cross cigarette, and we'd pass it around, take 3 or 4 drags. It seemed like kind of killed your hunger a little bit. And so, like I say, that's where I started to smoke.
The thing that saved I won't say saved my life, but saved my sanity was the Red Cross parcels. About once a week, each room, well, I think there are about 10 of us in a room, each room would get a Red Cross parcel, and boy, that really helped me because I was in there 11 months. By that time, I was skin and bones. And yet, and there would be cigarettes in those parcels too, and chocolate and D-bars, which we used to throw away, when we were in the service, but they were tasty when we were in prison. And so I've donated generously to the Red Cross ever since I got out, as you can suppose.
We're pretty much dependent on the Germans for the bulk of the food, and then we got the extras in the form of a Red Cross parcel, which contained some Nescafe, which is a soluble coffee, and some sugar cubes, and some corned beef, Spam, things like that, and vitamins. The guys were real gung-ho on having vitamins. They want to be sure they got plenty of vitamins because they didn't want to lose their manhood while they were there.
Red Cross deserves a lot of credit for keeping me alive there, and I continue to remember them with periodic contributions. The Red Cross parcel had enough basic food in, even without what the Germans gave you, probably to keep you it would keep you alive and in reasonable physical shape.
Food was the main thing. Without food, you're not going to last very long. So we did our best we would form combines. There were anywhere from 3 to 5 or 7 people would combine their food and to try to make it stretch more.
Some of us got packages, and we divided it up, everything except I kept a little pack or a little bottle of coffee, the kind that you mix with water. And another friend of mine from another barracks and I shared that for probably a month, little sips at a time. Just something you had of your own, that wasn't communal property. But everything else we shared.
We had a combine. We'd put all our food together and we would prepare the one meal a day, and we'd usually have bread and jam for breakfast with a cup of tea or coffee. And then rarely anything for lunch, and then the big meal was dinner. And I'll never forget, we cooked a stew once, and as the guy was bringing it hot through the door, he dropped it on the floor. We scooped it up and ate it.
We made out pretty good with the food. Not that we had very much, but I mean, we didn't. The Americans were very good. There wasn't any cheating and stuff going on. Very, very, very little. The Russian compound, I guess they had a terrific amount of that, but the GIs were really good with each other. Yeah.
Probably the first 4 to 6 weeks were the hardest part of captivity. Being captured is the hardest part, but the second hardest part then is trying to get used to being hungry.
So we started out hungry, and I never did have enough to eat until I was liberated on the 3rd of May in '45. Never did have really enough. It's just they give us rutabagas and boiled potatoes and black bread is the main things. We lacked nutrition. We lacked something that had some food value in it. If you had a flea bite or body lice, or, you'd scratch a little bit and them scratches would never heal. You didn't have enough food quite to heal. That shows you our diet was very inadequate.
I lost 40 pounds or more just sitting on my tail in prison camp. The fare was really bad. Somebody in later years tried to figure out what our diet had been and how much, and they figured that we had survived on like 700 calories a day. That was what we were living on. And you couldn't do much in the way of exertion with that.
Someone who is hungry chronically, and that is a condition that is to anybody who was a POW in the last year in Germany. It was pretty much their condition. There are 2 effects. First of all, there's a physiological effect. Your body will never quite recover from long-term starvation because there are unavoidable malnutrition effects that are systematic. Bones, skin, organs, everything. Then there's a psychological effect. And this occurs regardless of whether you're a POW or you're just hungry, as happened to a lot of Americans in the Great Depression. It's something that stays with you the rest of your life. And it stays with the POW the rest of his life. It's almost a cliche now that I will never be hungry again. But once you've been starving, that becomes a major motivator for everything you do from then on.
To this day, it bothers me to see the waste that America has. The amount of food, good food, that goes into garbage cans. When I finally got back to that air base in Port Said, Egypt, there was, and this was true in Italy too, there was a lineup of kids, and I guess they just let the kids in, but they would have their little tin cans for a cup, and they would be out at the garbage cans, lined up at the garbage cans, taking any garbage that the GIs would throw away. And I had been hungry to the point that I could understand hunger. What I would do, I would go through, eat my meal, and then I'd come back and get a tray, and I'd heap it up with pork chops or steaks or whatever it was, and take it out there and give it to those kids, because I understood what hunger was like. And so you can feel for them.
Overall, I really can't complain about the way I was treated in the prison camp. I always thought I was lucky I wasn't a prisoner of the Japanese, because the Germans overall abided by the Geneva Convention, which is the rule that governs prisoners of war and civilian internees. And so they pretty much abided by it.
As far as POW treatment is concerned, they set down rules about how POWs should be fed, how they could be incarcerated, what kind of work they could be put to, or what kind of conditions they could be held under. In general, POW had to be fed roughly the same rations your own soldiers were getting. This turned out to be a very nasty piece of work when your own soldiers were on starvation rations, of course, but that was the only legitimate way they could legalize that. Enlisted men could be put to work to manual labor, but not in direct support of your own war effort. Officers were not supposed to be put to manual labor at all. Again, all of these were observed and sometimes not observed quite so much, and there was a tremendous difference in the way the Germans observed them with communists or Bolshevik prisoners of war and the West. By and large, with the West, they tried to observe the letter of the law.
The treatment wasn't too bad. You could get an angry guard if he had gone home for the weekend and his house was blown apart while he was gone. He'd get pretty bitter. And as long as you did what you were told, I can't say that the treatment was bad.
In the big stalags where there were thousands of PWs, you didn't dare get their attention. I mean, boy, you stayed away from the guards, and when they yelled at you, you did what they said.
Actually, there's only once that I was walking to the latrine and I didn't have, my face wasn't shaved, you didn't shave regular, didn't have blades. And some German guard grabbed me and started calling me all kind of names in German, Schweinhund and a few other things. And you don't look like a soldier and this and that. And I just stood there at attention until he quit talking, and then he finally quit and I walked off. I figured I played that pretty cool because I could have given him a little sarcasm and he'd probably hit me with his rifle, but I didn't. I figured he had the rifle, I didn't. So I just stood at attention until he quit. That's the only thing that ever happened to me. And I never was abused otherwise. I saw one or two instances where the German took his rifle and hit the guy over the back because he didn't obey orders fast enough. But that's about all I saw in the way of abuse.
There was never any mistreatment. The only problem we ever had was just not enough to eat. But nobody was, I don't know of anybody in prison camp that was beaten. We had several guys that were badly beaten because they thought they knew something that they didn't no, but our treatment in camp was humane. I can't really complain about that.
See, all the able-bodied men were in the regular Volkssturm, or they were in the Army, or they were off on the Russian front or somewhere. There were just old men around. That's all that was left. And like I said, our guards were in the 70s, and they could hardly keep up with us. We were emaciated from lack of food, and we could walk better than they could.
The guards around our camp, number one, were what we would call unfit for military duty. They're generally older men, men in their 50s and 60s, and who probably had served in World War I and probably did not have the best of health. So they used them as guards on our camp. So they're a pretty decent sort, you know. We knew what their circumstances were. In fact, when we were evacuated in January 1945, it was hard going, and they were walking along with us, and some of those guards were in bad shape, so some of the guys carried their rifles for them.
The guards that we had when we were in the factory, you know, the guys that were at the barracks, they're just a bunch of nice old guys. We got to know them all by the first names. They just wanted it to be over with. And maybe they didn't feel that way when they first conquered France, you know, and everything was going Hitler's way. They may not have felt that way, but they sure did by 1944.
The Air Force personnel that we ran into, they were very friendly with us. You know, they weren't. But the SS, whenever they were around, everybody cowered. They were a very murderous bunch.
We had a little fat banker from Leipzig who was mean as the devil. He just well, one time he was always blasting us and yelling at us, and one time I came in, the last one to go into this old beer hall where we were kept, and he was standing in the doorway and yelling at the guys, and he grabbed me, pulled me over, looked at my neck, and he said, I think the word was Schwarz or something, meaning black, dirt, and he started hitting me. And, you know, we had no way to keep clean. We had no soap, we had no bathtub, we had nothing. And I was just ready to let him have it. And then I thought, no, you better not. That's a good thing I didn't. He might just take me out and shot me.
Some of the guards were friendly. Usually they were the older men that were there, and some of them dated back to World War I. The rough ones, and I've got a scar today from one. This was back when I was in the transit camp when they were getting ready, and I was where I wasn't supposed to be and talking where I wasn't supposed to be talking. And of course I was still young and cocky. And dumb. But anyhow, this guard come back there and kind of roughed me up a bit. And actually, I was there to go to the latrine, and he put me away with the butt of his rifle. I woke up bleeding all over the place and messed my pants all over the place from that. So wasn't very pleasant. Yeah, I'd like to see him again.
The Germans had a fighter plane factory about 15 to 20 miles from our camp, and they were bombing it one time, and the air raider had sounded, and when the air raider sounded in our camp, you had to stay in the barracks. You didn't go outside. And I was inside the barracks, but I happened to look across. There was one of our enlisted men in the camp was standing in the doorway, and a German guard saw him and shot him dead. Well, this man was just standing in the doorway. You know, there was nothing to get concerned about, but he'd been told that they shouldn't be outside. He assumed he was trying to be outside, so he killed him.
Within the German POW system, there was a distinct hierarchy of advantage. Highest advantage was to be a British or American officer. Your life wouldn't be pleasant, but at least it would be livable. At the other end of the extreme, if you were a Russian enlisted man, you were a dead man walking. Your chance of survival was, well, we don't know, because we honestly don't know how many Soviet POWs survived the war. Once the numbers get into the hundreds of thousands of missing and disappeared, you simply have no way of telling, but millions of them died, worked to death, starved to death, or just neglected to death.
And other than being as ornery as you could, there wasn't too much went on as far as the Americans were concerned. They had a Russian compound, and they killed 2 or 3 Russians every day, it seemed like, because they had a procession carrying, a funeral procession carrying them out to their cemetery. But we used to do stuff to them, and I was fortunate we had a guard in our compound. It had a little bit of humor. But one time the Red Cross had sent in some packages, and there were some little flags about that. The stick was about that long, little flag, you know. And you could walk across behind one of the guards with his rifle and his sling on his shoulder and just reach up and drop one of those sticks in his barrel, and here's a little American flag on his rifle. The commanding officer didn't like that very well. When we didn't have flags, sometimes we'd manage to get some toilet paper and just stick a piece of toilet paper on his bayonet. We did, yeah, we were hard to get. We made them force everything, and no, it wasn't Hogan's Heroes by a long way. It wasn't that easy.
There was a double fence. It's probably, I'd say, probably 5 or 6 feet apart, and in between are the big rolls of barbed wire, plus the barbed wire fence itself. And about every 200-300 feet would be a guard tower, and with a German up there, some German there 24 hours a day, with a submachine gun and mounted machine gun and searchlight, and they'd move the thing around irregularly and all during the night. Then the Germans would then they came in at night with what they call a Hundführer, with a German soldier with generally is a Doberman Pinscher or a German Shepherd, and walk around the camp. In case anyone got loose, they wouldn't be loose very long.
Because the German camps, most of them, were built in isolated areas, it wasn't the fence itself that was the major barrier. It was the fence plus the cleared area plus the observation of the cleared area in the fence. It wasn't a question of going under or over a couple of strands of wire or even 10 feet of wire and then running like the daylights. It was the fact you might have 100 yards of open ground to cover that's spotlighted, patrolled by dogs, or even, in extreme cases, mined.
Each barracks had a commander, and the barracks would get together with the camp commander. If you wanted to go into an escape thing of some kind, you had to present it to them at a meeting. You couldn't just go ahead and do it on your own.
If you wanted to make an escape, we had a panel of men that we'd have to go to get and present your plan and let them comment on it. And they'd either tell you no, or if they gave their okay, they'd give you all the help that they could with uniforms and that sort of thing.
The escape activity was very well organized. They had a man they called him Big X, who was in charge of the overall escape activities in the camp. You didn't decide to escape on your own. You had to clear everything and prove that you were qualified. Either you were physically qualified, and in some cases, what made you better qualified is being able to speak a foreign language. And if you spoke German, that made it even better. And then they would furnish you, if you wanted to escape, they'd furnish you with maps and some rations, and then you had to figure out your way. Some guys decided they wanted to escape, they cut through the barbed wire. And on a tunnel, that was a communal effort.
The only one I know that even tried was a fella. I don't even think that he got the permission from this panel, But I knew he was going, and he donned a white sheet of some kind, and it was snow on the ground. And he sneaked out of the barracks, which we weren't allowed outside at night, of course. And they had, all around the camp, they had the searchlights going, and they were searching back and forth, and they saw him, I'm sure, because they would go up one side with the searchlights, then it'd go down the other, and then they'd watch him move, and then they'd run the searchlight, never across his body. But he was itching his way to the fence, and I don't know what he was going to do when he hit the fence, but because there's 2 rows of fences with barbed wire in between. So he had a very poor plan. They let him go on for 3 or 4 hours, I guess, laying out there in the snow. Finally, they went out and got him.
The interesting thing about World War II, both in the German system and the Allied system, was the extreme difficulty of escaping, not because of the system themselves, but because of the physical conditions. If you escaped from a camp in Germany, you still had to somehow get out of Germany. The only thing worse than this is to escape from a British or American POW camp, which are across the Atlantic Ocean. And your chance of getting back home is virtually zero.
You had to be careful once you got out. See if they caught you around any railroad track or anything like that after dark. They didn't ask no questions, they shot you. And if you got out of a prison camp in the middle of Germany and you never had any money, your chances of paying out were pretty slim. The only hope you had was you'd get captured by somebody who wasn't going to shoot you.
I could have gotten out of that camp anytime I wanted to because I was familiar enough with the changing of the guard and all of that. And there was a time, and it was sometime in the late afternoon, when there was only one guard in each tower, and the rest of them were at mess, eating. And so it would have been no trouble getting out of that prison compound. But the problem would have been, what are you going to do when you get out? You're a long ways from your lines. In fact, we were so far from our lines, we never even tried to get back to the western lines. We went east because that's where safety was.
You should remember, your king called you the gentleman of the Air Force. Well, we're the gentlemen of the Air Force too. But out there, there are people you don't want to get in their hands. They're terrible people. They're not like us. They're not Air Force like you and I. And they were right. They were SS and so on like that. And they were right. But they would say, oh, no, don't escape. Don't escape. Those people out there are terrible. They're not gentlemen. Which was quite true.
It was a fantastic period of POW camp, as you can imagine. Because our main threat, our main concern, I think always, and everybody must have had the same, is how are we going to get out of here? If we win it, what are they going to do? If we lose it, what are we going to do? What are they going to do with us?
Both the Americans and the British set up organizations to implement escapes from the outside. The British had several executives which tried to provide equipment and supplies and expertise to the prisoners. I point out in some cases the prisoners also brought their own expertise, as American flyers were equipped with maps and other things that, if they could keep, were a tremendous aid once they got into the camps. The Americans, of course, had the escape factory, as it was called in the United States, which was doing very much what the British did in putting together specific items of equipment that could be used almost exclusively by POWs. And this is an example of the kind of resources the Western Allies had that Germany simply couldn't afford.
Somehow they had this idea of some organization manufacturing escape materials. They had the name, it was Aid to Prisoners of War Organization. It was a pseudo name so the German wouldn't suspect what they were doing, but they were sending, like they say, have a softball, open up a softball, and there might be a compass in there, and the backs might be hollow. They'd send over, might have, who knows what they would have. So we got a lot of stuff that way.
Everywhere in the POW camps, they attempted to set up their own internal organization. Sometimes it was based on a military rank, sometimes it was much more informal, but in every case, having a structure to your life that wasn't imposed by the enemy, again, was another small victory and gave you another plus in your survival column. Of course, once this organization is established, the next natural step is to apply the organization to escape attempts and to start organizing resources and expertise.
Escape activities, of course, I know I helped on the escape activity. Another fellow and I used to sew. We go in a room and they'd have posted guards out, and we made little caps, you know, with the bill on them. We had a pattern, and we'd cut it out of some old uniform and make these caps, so for civilian wear. And then we had people who did security. They had someone sitting near the gate. If a German came in, he'd have some way of passing the word on. He'd pick up a book and move it over someplace else and cross the barracks down later. The guy'd see what he'd moved, so he'd move the books that way. They'd know that a certain individual was a German individual was in camp, so we had pretty good security.
The camp was organized into a big X where you have the cloak and dagger work going on, and the big S, which was the security going on. And that was right through the whole camp. All the blocks were involved in this. We all had representatives doing it, and we knew where the Germans were all the time.
There are some remarkable escapes. The Wooden Horse, that's the name of the book. This guy built a vaulting horse out of an old Red Cross parcel box, and they put him in that thing, and then they hauled him out near the perimeter of the fence, and then he started digging, and then after he got through digging a certain length of time, he put the dirt up into the vaulting horse, crawled up into it, and closed off where he started his tunnel and camouflage it, and then they'd take it back into someplace and dispose of the sand. Next day he'd do the same thing, and he'd keep digging. After he'd gone so far, they'd put him down there. He'd go out, he'd go into this tunnel, and they'd close it up, and he'd start digging. And as he dug, he pushed the dirt back behind him like a mole. And this guy made it. He moled out and escaped and got back to England.
One guy escaped, and I can't imagine how he did it. As I understand it, he phonied up a uniform some way and went out through the gate. How the hell he did it? He was a cocky little guy. He was airborne. He was in gliders. So he was kind of a tough little nut, I guess. But he got caught before he got very far, but he got out. And of course they slapped him in the dungeon for a week or whatever, I don't know.
I remember one time I walked in a room and they were getting this man ready to go out the gate as a German officer or German soldier. And he had a German uniform on, and he had a German rifle in his pocket. What the heck, how'd he get that? Well, it was a RAF uniform, which they'd changed a little bit and cast the ornaments that go on the uniform, including the eagle. And then the rifle was made out of wood and been carved as a perfect duplication of a German rifle. And what they did, they had this man who looked like one of the Germans that came into the camp. He was just a spitting image. It could have been twins. It was remarkable. And they did this, had him wear this uniform with the necessary documents. When this other man that looked like him, a German, came into camp, this guy and I think 15 or 20 others went up to the gate, showed their document. The German let him through because he had the regular documents, and he had a rifle, and he assumed he was authentic, and went out the gate. And so we had 21 out there, but they were allowed to lose about half a day.
So anyway, the escapes and one thing another got to be so rampant that they moved us to a place called Stalag 17B. And I remember the first formation we had when we got there, they lined us all up, and Sergeant Turk was the German in charge of the camp. He guided us all up, and we all had to stand there at attention. And he said, "Gentlemen, I must tell you this. Escaping will no longer be the sport. Anyone trying to escape will be shot." And we all threw our hats up in the air and cheered. And a couple days later, somebody tried it, and he had a nice funeral. Escaping from Stalag 17B wasn't like Hogan's Heroes and the movie. It was damn serious business. You'd have to get shot.
The common image of a POW escape in World War II is of a bunch of people tunneling out. Tunneling has a lot of problems associated with it. It has the great single advantage in that while you're going through the most dangerous part of the camp, you're underground where they can't shoot at you. The disadvantage is that it requires a great deal of concentrated engineering effort and a certain amount of expertise if you're going to get out without killing yourself. It is also complicated by the physical characteristics of Germany. A great many of the camps in northern Germany, because most of northern Germany, were built on sandy soil, which you can tunnel through very easily if you don't mind the tunnel collapsing on you, but requires an immense effort in shoring and propping to keep the tunnel open. So in any of those camps, all the Germans had to do was look for wood. And if wood was disappearing, somebody's building a tunnel, because they can't build a tunnel any other way. But the tunneling effort invariably was another one of those group efforts. It was an organized effort by a disciplined group in the camp, and it took a group working together to make it even have a remote chance of success.
The guys were tunneling a lot, and at one point they thought that the bunk I was in would be the closest to the fence, and so we raised some boards up and we cut the nails off, but we left the heads so they looked like they were nailed. And while I didn't get involved in the digging, they dug, I think they must have dug like 75 feet or 100 feet out. But they had some people, we called them moles, they were always snooping and looking for tunnels, always alert. And a few tunnels did make it outside, but the guys didn't get away. It was pretty bad.
Well, I don't know what happened. Where this tunnel was in the in a barracks that was occupied by all Polish officers, and it was a fluke that they found the entrance to the cabin, and when the Germans discovered it, well, of course they evacuated everyone out of the building, and they went down there to look at the thing, and the darn thing was almost ready to break, probably about 150 feet in length, and so the Germans wanted to destroy it. So they sent someone up ahead and put in a charge of dynamite and set it off. They figured that'd collapse the tunnel, but it didn't collapse the tunnel. What it did, the force went right back to the source and blew the roof off of the barracks, which we greeted with great applause.
One time at the other end of our camp, they managed to dig a tunnel from our compound over to the Russian compound. And it was the Russians, I think it was about five Russians through that tunnel into our compound, and we sent 5 Americans the other way into their compound so that they could get out, because they would take them out of camp and work them. And they did, these Russians, they would hide in the tunnels. It was pretty hard to keep them hidden, and we had to move them. They could move as long as nothing was going on. They could walk one barracks to another without detection. But once they ran everybody outside and lined them up, then they would search under the ground for, and it was a little trouble to keep them well hidden. But we managed to keep them hidden. They would have killed them instantly if they'd have found them. And I never did hear what happened to the Americans that went out on that side.
the digging was a very small part of it because they had where we were, it was very sandy soil, so they had to get rid of that sand, and so the Germans always looked for fresh sand. So what they did, and when they built this tunnel, they made false gardens. They just piled of sand in these one spots and then covered over with dirt and made it look like their little garden, you know. So that's why they got rid of the sand.
And the thing is, now you move a lot of sand if you're going down 13 feet. You move a lot of sand. What the hell do you do with it, you see? That was the big problem, getting rid of sand. I mean, it's awful. You know, talk about logistics. But that was the big problem. You try to get rid of, you know, a few hundred cubic feet of sand. It's quite a problem. But it was done, and we got rid of it.
The Red Cross coats that we had through the protective power had linings. And what we did was to take the linings out of them and put them down inside our pants and have a piece of cord around the bottom of it. And as the sand came out of the tunnel, it was poured down into our pants. We then went out into the camp, which was on sand anyway. It was a pine forest. And we undid the string and we walked around, and they never did find out where the stuff was coming from. They didn't even know it was there. Of course, the whole camp was working on Tom, Dick, and Harry. We had 3 tunnels going.
The reason they put no name Tom, Dick, and Harry is instead of referring, well, the tunnel over in Barrack 204, German might overhear that. But if they'd start talking about Tom or Dick or Harry, the Germans wouldn't know what the heck we were talking about. We knew what we were talking about. So that was the only reason. That was just a subterfuge to name for the tunnels.
There was a great big stove, and under that there was a tile to put it on, and under that again there was generally a brick for part of the fireplace at the chimney. And this one we found a place where there was no bricks underneath. Oh. So, I mean, I wasn't part of this planning, but I was part of the digging when it got going. So we pulled back the stove, you know, pulled back the thing, and that was our sort of face of the top of the tunnel. That's the tile. They're all stuck together. You know, all the tiles were together. That was our lid for the tunnel.
The tunnel had to be shored up with boards, so everybody had to contribute 2-3 boards from their bed, because our beds were just boards and they call it pellias, which is a wood fiber stuff for a mattress. So they used those bed boards to shore up the tunnel, and then of course they were down there quite a ways, so they had to have fresh air. So they made a pump. They made a bellows. Some guy was down there and pumped this thing there. Made a bellows out of a barracks bag, and so they could pump air into these guys, and had a intake. It went up to the walls, and I don't know where it went, but it was well concealed, so these guys couldn't become asphyxiated for a lack of oxygen. And then they had wooden rails, and they had little carts, so the guy was working on the tunnel could scoot down at the other end. But there's always a danger of cave-in, and I don't know if they ever had some small cave-in, but nothing very serious. If real serious, there was no way of getting them out.
But Bert and I were just the moles. We were the diggers, you know, and we were down. I would pull there was all in North Camp, the Great Escape. They had electricity down tunnels. They had a railroad for the things. Well, we just had sleds, and we used to get lots of margarine. And instead of oil lamp, we'd have margarine lamp. It'd burn. It'd be a stinky thing, but it'd burn. But I'd throw the sand behind for Bert, and he would put it on in and pull it to the cord, and away they'd go. No, it was a lot of fun. And of course, it was interesting to do. There wasn't much else to do. Well, there were other things to do. We played basketball, played games, but tunneling was our fort.
The best known POW event, if you will, of World War II. It's probably the Great Escape, which was out of a Luftwaffe camp, and therefore was entirely an Air Force operation, although it combined several different air forces to do it. The peculiarity of the Great Escape was that it was a multinational operation, that the Luftwaffe had combined British and American airmen in the same camp, almost entirely NCOs or officers. What hadn't occurred to them was that this meant that they had an extremely intelligent, well-educated, well-trained, and well-motivated group all in the same place, and with a wide range of civilian experience behind them. And consequently, they organized an extremely disciplined group within the camp, set up a planning operation, and took into account all aspects of the escape attempt, not just the digging of tunnels and the technology and engineering that went into that, but also the development of escape kits that enabled people to get out of the tunnel and then keep moving. But to do that required an immense technical effort of getting out of the camp in the first place, to where they dug 3 different tunnels, so that if any one or even 2 of them were found, they still had a backup. They started them from different points. They dug them at different depths to different lengths. They used an elaborate system to make the tunnels longer than they actually had to just get out of the camp. And they had the advantage that among the people in the camp were, in fact, people with mining experience and digging experience, forgers, cameramen, intelligence officers that knew all about counterintelligence, to where the Germans, in fact, had some inkling that something was going on, just because these men were just too busy for their own good, but in fact did not shut down the escape attempt till after it took place.
They figured that they'd go, say, 225 feet, and they figured they'd gone 220 feet. Well, this should be far enough, so they went up. Well, they should have gone another 15 or 20 feet, but they'd miscalculated some way in their plans, so they came up that much short and near where a German was patrolling the perimeter of the camp. And of course he gave the alarm, and by that time 88 people had gotten loose.
But they had to go on with it. Once they'd broken it, they had to go on. So what they did was as a person came up the trap, there was a guy on the other side in the trees with a piece of rope once he'd got across. And the possums were walking around, and during the time that the possum wasn't there, this fellow would watch what was going on and yank the rope, give the man the nod that the fellow was going the other way. And it was quite by accident, I think, that he found this thing walking around there, found somebody sort of coming up in the ground. He fired a shot in the air. It was about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I think. And of course, all hell broke loose.
Some of the people that escaped out of that tunnel, the one that I remember real well, a fellow by the name of Roger Bushnell, who spoke German fluently. In fact, he had been educated in Germany, although he was South African, but he spoke German fluently and French fluently, and he was well qualified to get passed for a German any day of the week. And he was captured on the story in the book tell about these guys that were captured and the circumstances. He was waiting at a train station near the Swiss border with another ex-POW, and they were tracked by a German officer who was checking potential escapees, and they said, "Well, you're okay," and all of a sudden this German walked away, and all of a sudden he yelled back, says, "How's it going?" He said, "Oh, fine," There's an old trick they use, speak in their own language, and they instinctively reply in your own language. That's how he got captured.
The Great Escape put about 80 people into the German countryside. Virtually all of them were recaptured. 50 of them were executed. And the greatest mass execution of POWs in a single place, a single time from a single camp, at least as far as Western POWs are concerned. And it was done specifically on Hitler's orders. He was incensed by the resources that were tied up, and he wanted to make an example of them. At the same time, there was immense opposition to this among the German officer corps, because this was distinctly an illegal act. And if it became known, the chance of reprisals against their own people was immense.
Cookie Long, who was in my room, was a tunneler. He was shot. He was one of the people that got out. He had no languages. He was just an ordinary flyer from Dorset, somewhere in Cornwall, just a steady-going sort of guy. He was one of the people that the Gestapo murdered in the 50. He was in my room. So I got quite close to it that way. And I knew, I suppose, 50% of the people who were shot I knew, because I was down in 42, and I was a relatively old POW.
But at the time, when they had planned to break the tunnel that night, they brought all the people that were going to go escape. We were all prepared with clothing, the necessary civilian clothing or whatever, and food and maps and compasses and ID cards if they had to have them. And they were sitting in the barracks waiting to go out the tunnel. There was about, I don't know, 200 or so. I forget how many, but it was over that. And I thought it was lucky that they came up short, because if they'd gotten 200 people out, Hitler would probably had them all shot. So I was going to say, well, they only shot 50. So you're lucky in that respect, because the war ended a year and a half, or a little over a year later anyway.
And the ashes were sent back to us in the summer of 44. The ashes were all the 50 that were killed, with their names on it.
They were gone, the only word you can use is they were assassinated, I guess. Took their bodies to various towns around the area and cremated the remains, and then brought the remains into near our camp. And we had decided we wanted to build a memorial, which the Germans allowed us to do, so we built a memorial. As far as I know, it's still there. There's 50 men. This one man I was telling you about earlier, who has been my roommate, his name is Mike Casey. He was captured the day the war was started. And that was 39, and he was executed in 44. He's just newly married. A nice guy.
In early January of 1945, when the Russians started their drive across Poland, they started moving those prison camps back west, out of the line of the Russian advancing.
We were at Krems, which is about 40 kilometers from Vienna. And so when the Russians were about to take Vienna, the Germans marched us west. We just started marching west. And even we knew it was better to be in the hands of the Germans than it was in the hands of the Russians.
If you weren't going to go down in a glorious final burst of glory, and if you were SS, you didn't have a whole lot of choices in the matter, but if you were an ordinary soldier, you wanted to find the most civilized people possible to surrender to, and those were, by and large, the Americans. And definitely not the Soviets, because you had a pretty good idea of how you treated Soviet soldiers, and you had no reason to expect any different treatment at the hands of the Red Army.
Well, they were pretty frightened. I mean, they didn't like the Russians. And we heard them coming night after night. You could tell that the bombardments were getting closer.
They wanted the Americans to recapture us, not the Russians. And I think they knew the war was coming to an end, and they didn't want to anger the Americans, I don't think, at that point. And I think that was one of the reasons.
The majority of the prisoners were moved by foot marching. And of course, this brings up another set of problems. Because the food supplies in the camps had already been reduced dramatically, the prisoners were in no physical shape to march. And especially late in the year, when they were marching in the autumn and the winter of 1944-45, the winter conditions in that part of Germany I have experienced. And they are cold, and they are wet, and your chance of getting through it even in good health without turning into bad health are very small, and if you're in bad health to start with, your survival rate is dramatically worsened.
Our CO, Alkire was his name, he had the foresight to tell us, hey, get off your duff and start walking around the compound because we're going on marches. And if he hadn't have done that, we'd have never made it. I started going on. I found that I couldn't even walk around the compound once. And but gradually I built myself up to where I could sustain myself pretty good. And the rest of them all did the same.
We could hear explosions where the bombing raids were going on and so on. And the German officer in charge of the Stalag told us that he and his men were being changed to other duties and that we'd be taken over with an SS group. Well, we dreaded that. But anyway, the SS group told us that next day that we'd be marching.
We knew things were happening because camps north of us, I presume, were coming through and stopping in our camp since there was some room. And they were a little bit of everything, not American flyers. I think maybe, I don't remember if they were British, a little bit of everything. Anyhow, they were on their way. So we knew things were changing, and then they had everybody who was unable to walk, had a health problem, and there were several of them, left by train. There was a train station at the little town right by the camp, and they had a terrible time, I'm sure, on the train. We could hear the artillery. Figured it was Uncle Joe.
In January 45, the Germans were retreating, and the Russians were only 20 or 30 miles away. We could hear the front was real close. And one night about 1:30 in the morning, the Germans came in and said, you have to leave. So they made us pack up what we had, and we walked out, started walking west. And all we could take was what we could carry with ourselves, or make makeshift sleds to carry our belongings, whatever we had. And we walked in that, pretty cold. They said it was 0, which was, of course, everything in Europe is centigrade, as you know. But there was about a foot or a foot and a half of snow.
We packed up everything we could, and we broke up bed slats and made sled, our crew did. Made a sled and put all we could on that, And as we left the gate, they opened the warehouse full of Red Cross parcels, and we took all of those that we could hold. So the first day or two, we did pretty well for eating.
I think we marched probably, 3 weeks. And it was early April, or late April, mid-April. But it was cold, and we'd get snowed on, and it would freeze at night, and we'd have to sleep outside. Everybody still had their GI overcoat, which was fortunate, because they're a pretty good thing to wear.
Well, we marched. We were kicked out one day. We were given a little warning, and we were told we could take what we could on our backs, and we took a Red Cross parcel apiece, I think, and any clothing and socks, anything that we could possibly. We just dumped out into the snow and walked all that night, finished up in a barn somewhere with the doors closed and no sanitary stuff. It was hard. That was a brute. We didn't know where we were going or anything until we got ourselves together and decided that we would march, all right, that we would stop 10 minutes on the hour like the services do in Britain. They stopped 10 minutes before the hour and sit.
They came in one night, said, "You're marching out of here tomorrow." And it was cold, and slept on the road. A couple of times we got into old factories, and at least it was warm. One night we spent in the barns. And the guys, that was like being in Saskatchewan in the wintertime, I'll tell you.
We were marching about 3 months, and somebody kind of kept track by reading kilometers on the road or on the road signs in towns. Figured about 500 miles, and the first day was the worst, I guess, sort of, because we weren't in shape. and we were trying to carry what little stuff we had, which was damn little. And roads were icy, and so it was hard walking. Cobblestones that are covered with ice are difficult to walk on.
But as we went, it was night and colder than heck, and it was snowy. And you could see overcoats and Red Cross parcels and everything alongside the road where the fellas just couldn't haul it. And the German people got a blessing on that score. But we were a long time marching. I read somewhere some fella that had made notations, and he knew every little hamlet and village that we went through. It was a pretty. Matter of fact, we had heard about this death march, in Bataan. We thought it was comparable, but of course it wasn't. But it was bad. The cold was the worst, and the hunger.
And this was one of the coldest winters they had. It was on February 6th. And we were on that road for 86 days, sleeping out sometimes, mostly in barns. Very little to eat. Potatoes mostly was our big ration.
And sometimes nothing to eat for a couple of days. We tried to scrounge. If you felt brave, you could run out into a field and maybe dig up a kohlrabi or a potato or something. Mainly, we were just trying to survive. And that was foremost in our minds. And to get a drink of water. You have to have water. A lot of times we couldn't, there was no water. Even when we stayed in some of those barns on the farms, we couldn't get water.
At one point, they gave us a 5-minute rest every hour when we were marching, and we had sat on a bank where the road had been cut a little bit. And then it was time to go, and the guard said, "Up, go," and nobody moved, and everybody was not very strong anymore. And he got very angry. He just took his machine gun right across our heads, like that, just above our heads. And then everybody slowly got up.
I remember walking along, crying, and I got mad. I said, "You're not going to kill me like this." I had frozen tears on my face. I was just exhausted. And it was always 6 more kilometers to go. Got to Spremberg, was put in a warm factory after no shelter at all on that 4 weeks.
And we were to walk from Hohenlohe over to Würzburg, and from Würzburg to Nuremberg, and our final leg eventually turned out to be 100 miles or 200 miles from Nuremberg to Munich. We found out that, and we noticed, of course, we found out Würzburg had been bombed a day or two before by American and British planes. And they told us that, they were very angry, told us that around 24,000 civilians had been killed. And they said, "You're not going on to Nuremberg right away, you're going to stay here and dig out bodies." And they took what Jewish boys we had with us and put them with a group of Russian prisoners digging out unexploded bombs. There was some unexploded ordnance. And they put them in a very dangerous position.
We went through various means, mostly walking, from Sagan to Nuremberg. And we took a little prison camp there. It wasn't very big. And they kicked out the Russian troops there. And as sorry a mess as we were, they were so much worse off that we gave them candy and cigarettes and things that we had, because I don't know where they went from there. Maybe they went out and got shot. But we were in Nuremberg for probably a month. And we endured quite a few air raids, British air raids at night in Nuremberg.
And went to Nuremberg, bombed. That was a terrible thing. We were within a few miles of city center, and we experienced very, very severe bombing from British and Americans. British was the worst because at night it's that much worse. Flares, sometimes they'd bomb on red, sometimes on yellow, sometimes on white. And one night they had a bomb raid in which there was a flare coming down right over our camp. And I said, oh God, I hope that's not it. And it wasn't. But we had bomb fragments and anti-aircraft shell fragments falling into the camp.
They were bombing all around Nuremberg, just outside of our camp. And our camp was ringed with 88s. So they were shooting the guys down and all that crap that goes up, as they tell you. If it goes up in the air, it's got to come down.
There was one day when they said later, I read later in the papers that over 2,000 planes came over and bombed Nuremberg that night. And the Germans had anti-aircraft batteries set up right in the middle of our camp, which is, of course, a violation of the Geneva Convention. And the way we were affected by this was that they were firing directly overhead, and the shrapnel came back to earth and came right through the tents. And the only thing we could do was get underneath the boards that we were supposed to be laying on and try to protect ourselves. The thing that I noticed was a lot of the fellows had diarrhea in there, and they were running out to the latrines, and sometimes they get hit by shrapnel, cut in the head. It was not a pretty scene at Nuremberg.
Having a lot of radio men in our organization, of course, every bomber crew had a radio man. They had made up some crystal sets and stuff, and we did get news from BBC that way, and we had an idea of where our troops were and what was happening. We knew it was getting pretty had to be getting close to the end.
Third Army, General Patton's was coming, making a terrific drive, and they were almost within sight of our camp, and the Germans evacuated us again. So we had to start walking. We walked about 150 miles. We went from Nuremberg almost to Munich, a little town called Moosburg. So we were on the road for another 2-3 weeks, I guess.
On that last march, it was spring, and actually it was good. We were outside, and every village we came to, we got food from the natives, and so we ate good for the first time. A lot of potatoes we'd cook up, in cans. So that trip was very pleasant in comparison to the way we were living. But I remember one time we were put up in, our guards would go ahead and try to make arrangements for barns, to put us up for the night. And one place that we went into, I went into this barn and there were a couple of SS officers in the barn. Evidently they were staying there. And they didn't do anything. And you don't care what happens when you're in those situations. And I just went into the barn and made a place for myself to sleep, and I don't know what happened to them, but they didn't give us any trouble. In those times, though, right at the end of the war, and everybody knew it, I suppose they were pretty interested in staying alive. I know some of the people that I got food from would give me a piece of paper and indicate that they would want me to write that they were helping me, which I did. They give you eggs or bread or something, and then shove this paper at you and a pencil, and we write, say, these people are good people. They gave me something to eat.
I teamed up with a British guy, and we decided we were going to barter for some food. And we found a farmer who said that he would give us 8 kilos of bread, and that's a great big round loaf of black bread for my shoes, my GI shoes, my boots. So we agreed, and I gave him my shoes. He gave us a big loaf of bread. I then cut out the back lower part of my overcoat and kind of made Robin Hood slippers, tied them on my feet. And by this time in April, it wasn't really freezing anymore, so we had mighty wet feet, but it wasn't freezing. So I hobbled on down the road with that, but we did have something to eat. This British guy and I, we split the loaf of bread.
It was a cakewalk compared to the other walk out of in the blizzards from Stoneglyph 3. Went down to several small towns, and they encamped us in barns that we got guys in. And we would come into these little German towns and literally take them over because we had cigarettes and we could barter. They were like money. And we could get food, eggs, and foodstuffs, bread and potatoes and what have you. And walk freely because there was only probably one guard for every 100 prisoners.
They were moving all the air officers down south to be for Hitler's retreat, and we were going to be hostages. That was the story anyway, and I guess it was true, because that's where we ended up, down in Moosburg, which is very close to Munich. And there we were in huge big tents, a couple hundred in a tent, you know. It was just packed, one body after another. And if anybody had to get up at night, it was something, stepping over bodies to get there.
Then the weather got better between Hamburg and Lübeck. We walked up that bit. And we lived in some big properties, stables in the straw and stuff. And then the war went through us, and we were on our way home.
Now, we knew that the Third Army wasn't too far away because we had already been evacuated out of Nuremberg, which was north and west of us. So we knew that the Germans were pretty close, and we could hear the firing, and it was over real quick. And we finally ended up at Moosburg, and we were only there about 2-3 days, and then General Patton caught up with us, and we were liberated the 29th of April, 1945. And Patton was right there when they got our camp. Pearl handle pistols and everything else.
Patton's troops came in, the tanks and all. We heard those rumbling up a couple of days before they came. And the guards there are all vacated. They left the gates open and all. So we just hung in where we were. But there were some SS fanatics out on the road that I can remember. They had a machine gun, and they were shooting at these tanks coming down the road. Can you imagine that? And then the tanks came in, and it was real thrill to get liberated.
Well, there was a Jeep drove into camp one day, and I think it was a lieutenant. He stood up, and guys started flocking around, and he said, "You're back in the Army, you can act like soldiers." That's all he said. He said, "We couldn't feed you." He said, "Our supplies are 20 miles behind us." It was Patton's Third Army, I guess, and there was some tanks somewhere back there.
No, we were literally liberated by two drunken Russian camp followers, really. They're Mongolians. Our camp was bypassed we were up on the Baltic, and our camp was bypassed by the Russian troops, and we were left in a pocket up there by ourselves. And the Germans took off, left us there, and these two Russians came in the middle of the night, and they wore fez hats and had air-cooled submachine guns slung across them, and they came to liberate us. Then, of course, right away the rest of the horde came, and we were under the Mongols for a couple of weeks before the crack troops came back and restored order.
The first sign of liberation that we saw was a sort of an ordinary observation car with a corporal and a private and a radio. That's all. They'd broken through from the Second Army, and they found us as POWs. We found out the next morning that our camp was absolutely surrounded by Germans waiting to surrender, which was an amazing thing. And we formed our own interrogation group, and the Germans came in by the thousand, threw all their rations at us and so on. And then my most memorable sight, I think, is leaving Lubeck. And there was a large barbed wire entanglement, absolutely covered in puddles and rain and crap, filled with Germans who were taking over our role. We were on our way out. They were on their way in. And it was a wonderful feeling of sort of victory.
There wasn't any big celebration, the group I was with. It was just another day. We'd walk so long and put up with so much. That was just another day. We were free, as far as we could tell. And we didn't go looking for a house to break into or to get into to sleep or anything. We went looking for a barn with clean straw, which we were used to. And we're three of us together at that time from the crew, myself, Don, and waist gunner John Rona. He was Polish descent, spoke Polish. And we went into a barn that looked likely, and it was nice, clean straw. And there was a Polish family in there, a young man and a woman and a little baby, and I believe another guy. And John Dub, we called him, he talked to him, and of course all of those people thought we were heroes when they found out we were flyers. We were all pilots. They were slave labor, had the P with the diamond shape on it. No, what were they going to do? Nobody knew. They didn't know what to do. The country was full of slave labor.
And there were civilians and soldiers and everything running away from the advancing Russian army. We were so close to them. The road was just congested as far as you could look. About late in the evening on the 2nd of May, we started to get spread out more, and the guards started to disappear. We had our guards with us until that 2nd of May, but they disappeared sometime, and then we were getting scattered out. And so about 2 in the morning on the 3rd of May, I found myself all alone, and I was running. Heck, I was getting so happy to be liberated. So the first American I saw was 82nd Airborne. Just one soldier out there.
We got down to toward a little village called Mooseburg, and it's just outside of the concentration camp of Dachau. When we got near Mooseburg, not in the village, but got near it, one night we were put into some farmers' houses, and we were sleeping in some hay in their basements on piles of potatoes and things. And there you could eat some raw potatoes finally. And the next morning, after we were in this farmer's place, our guards came in to us, and they stacked their arms. And most of our guards were old men. They were guys from World War I, old men. They were in their 70s. We could have gotten away at any time, but there was safety in numbers. Where are you going to go when you're going to run right into the SS lines? So we decided to stay together. They came and said, they stacked their arms, and they said, your countrymen are in the village ahead of us where we're supposed to go. And they said, would you send a couple of your countrymen up there and tell them to come back and get us? So a couple of our guys went on up into Mooseburg and said there's a whole bunch of GIs, most of us from the 99th and some British, back in the farms back this way. So they sent a truck back, a GI truck, and they picked us up, and they picked up our guards, and hauled us back into town.
A waist gunner. He was man of confidence in our compound, and he worked with this Captain Kaplan on the march, and he come up to me the day before we was liberated, and he says, Len, he says, I'm going to tell you and Dom this. We were on his crew, but he says, for whatever you say, don't let it out. But he says, in the morning we're going to go, the German officer and I are going to go and meet the British. We know where they're at. They're not very far ahead. So that morning they took off with these sticks and a great big white flag on them, a towel or some damn thing. And the British came back. And while we were standing there, here comes some more Germans in with rank. You can see it on their shoulders. And this one German officer, when he got up at the vehicle they were in, he went up, he told that British man, he says, see my rank? That British guy reached up and pulled that off of his shoulder, and he threw it down on the ground and stomped it down on the ground, shoved him over there. He says, get over there with the rest. Oh, those British, they hate, oh, God. But you can't blame them. God, look what they did to London and that. There was no love there.
We started marching west again, and after a couple of we went through the German front lines, mostly old folks and kids, and we'd been marching about 2 hours, and we went around a corner, and there was a Jeep with a very nervous American sergeant behind it with a .50 caliber machine gun pointed at us. And we started yelling, don't shoot, we're Americans, don't shoot, we're Americans. Well, he looked kind of confused, and there was a diamond patrol out at both sides of the road, and so he asked them, yelled at them, go check on them, see if they really are Americans. So they came over and talked to us, and they asked questions like, who won the World Series, or who so-and-so, and they started yelling back, yeah, they are, Sarge, they're Americans, and that's how we got freed. That was the 25th of April, 1945, and that was the very day that the Americans met the Russians at the Elbe River, just a few kilometers from where we were. Of course, we didn't know it till much later, but that's how I got freed.
When you lay on the ground at night, you could hear the ground would tremble. And it was George Patton and his people coming. And you could see German units falling back out in the open fields. Horse-drawn artillery, infantry, pulling back. We convinced the German lieutenant to let us paint POW on top of the barn. Rolling the dice, it might help. It wasn't a regular camp. It wasn't on anybody's map. And we were in the barn. We didn't go into work, and we could hear artillery fire or some kind of fire. And then Sherman tanks, we couldn't really see them behind a little rise in the village. 3 or 4 Sherman tanks arrived. They started firing into the village. They killed 8 or 9 people. And you could see a Piper Cub type of airplane. It spotted fire for tanks. That type of plane. He was flying above the tanks. He was calling the fire. He circled over that village, and we're laying on the ground inside the barn, looking out the door. And he saw that sign, and he did this. And the firing stopped, just like that. And crowd guards took off. And the gate, they opened the gate. And we ran out and laid down between stone houses, but they stopped firing. I don't know, half an hour or so, 4 Sherman tanks come rolling into that town. We were milling around like a Mardi Gras parade here. We were so excited with this guy. And they're throwing stuff out the tank at us. They had a ration called 10-in-1 rations, but infantry couldn't carry it because they were big boxes. They had all kind of stuff in it. Condensed milk and cheese and chocolate. And they were tossing it like favors at a party, you know. Really too rich for us. But the most significant part happened then was that in a few minutes, a Jeep came up, an American major in it. And he stood up and said, all the POWs gather around. And he said, The infantry's following us in trucks. If they don't get here in half an hour, these tanks are ordered. I've told the sergeant, turn around and take them back out. No one will get on these tanks. You're on your own. And he took off, back. And we're figuring, you know, what we're going to do is find the best looking house in town and hide in the cellar or something. Because the Germans are notorious for counterattacking, and there was all kind of units that passed near us. We saw them. But the sergeant in the lead tank was standing in the turret. He heard what he said. He said, gather around. And he said, and I quote, we all heard what that asshole had to say. Now listen to what I have to say. If we get the call to turn around, everybody on. My kind of man. About 25 minutes went by, and here comes the 80th Infantry. And school was out. We were seriously liberated at that point. Everybody's got a liberation story. It was a POW. That's mine.
After a lot of rough combat, and I was captured, and I was put in a prison camp, and it was a relief not to have to shoot at anybody anymore or kill anyone. And the person, of course, has to think about all those people down where you dropped those bombs also, you know, and that's kind of a mean thing.
I have seen German soldiers who were prisoners in Russia coming home, and their filthy, dirty, greasy clothes, and maybe don't have shoes. And I think about them, may not have any family left, and no place to go. And I think about how fortunate I am that I had something to come home to. And those guys, granted, they did terrible things, a lot of them, but a lot of them were just young men like me.
That is such a traumatic part of your life, and so different from any kind of experience that you've had before or since, that the impact both of the combat activity and the experience of being a prisoner, which is so far afield from anything today, that it's very much a part of my life.
And of course, we were all in trouble together, and as I've often said, I've never met such a wonderful bunch of people with the same cause. I've never felt such companionship and understanding as I had during that period of POW days. That's my main sort of theory about that particular phase of my life, I think. I was very fortunate in many ways to survive, and I met the most wonderful people in the world.
So it was an experience that I wouldn't want to go through again, but it was an experience that I lived through, and I gained from it. I can say that. I gained from it, although in a painful way.
I keep thinking about my brother. A year or two after the war, one day we were talking, and he said, let's face it. He said, World War II was the highlight of our lives. And I thought about that. Oh, God. I wonder if there's other people that think that. The nearest I could tell, that was one of the low points in my life.
About 3 years ago, 20 of us and our wives went back to the old prison camp over in Poland. Took a tour up through the Scandinavia, and that was very sentimental. And of course, met guys I never knew before. I knew 2 or 3 of them that went with me, but it's we're the lucky ones that got to come home. You know.